Welcome to our FA Leagues and Clubs podcast, looking at the topic of money matters. Throughout the season, we've been delivering a number of webinars on a variety of topics ranging from community engagement to marketing and communications. But with the return of the Premier League back on our screens and the restrictions of football activity easing, we wanted to continue to still share important information just in a more convenient way for you. The first podcast series of its kind for League and Club volunteers will look into the topic of money matters, where over the next 4 weeks we'll cover a basic overview of club finances, the way in which to manage money, how to work within budgets and taxes which clubs should be aware of. Each podcast will be shared with podcasts. Please visit our website at www.thefa.com/get-involved/player/clubs and leagues. So by way of introduction, my name is Danielle and I'm the National Club Services Manager here at the Football Association, and I'm delighted to be joined today by James from Sporting Assets. Welcome, James, again to our fourth podcast of the series around money matters. James, for those that haven't joined us today, can you just haven't joined us before, sorry, not today, because they are on the call today, which is great, but if those that haven't joined us before, you just give an overview of who you are, who Sporting Assets does, and what you do there?
Great, thanks Danielle, and I'm pleased to be online again to talk about money matters. So yeah, I work for Sporting Assets. I'm senior consultant there. We work across sport, various different projects, and a number in football. We tend to work with community-led projects, often around facilities, either taking on a facility, upgrading a facility, but also more general kind of capacity building and raising finance. So we work primarily often with volunteer committee members, some of which will have kind of skills and expertise in the area of finance, and many more will it won't be something that necessarily comes to them naturally, or certainly isn't something that they do in their day job. So you know, from our perspective, having you know, a degree of knowledge in this area, at least kind of understanding the main terminology and responsibilities and sort of good practice at a simple level, is something that we think is really useful for those people, because you know, there are responsibilities of being on a committee, and you know, it's very difficult to kind of check and challenge and contribute if, you know, you're scared by the kind of topic matter per se. So that's really what we're trying to do with this little series, is to make people feel a bit more comfortable, you know, but it's pitched at people that perhaps don't see this area as their natural area of expertise.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. Your introduction was a lot better than mine. I got definitely tongue-tied when I was talking, and just tongue-tied there again. Anyway, let's move on. So I think it's really important to say that at this stage, for anyone that is listening, neither James or I or any of the other guests we've had on previous webinars work in the finance industry professionally. All the information we share with you today is just basic terminology and processes. And if you do need any further advice, professional advice, we do say that you should go and seek that and ensure that everything that you need to implement is overseen by a professional financial service. So without further ado, let's get started. James, it would be really great if you could give us a small 2-minute recap for those that haven't been able to catch up on our previous webinar around the topic of how to work within budgets.
Sure, yeah, we had a good session last time with Derek as well. You know, budgets are something that we see in everyday life. Some of us are naturally good at it, some bad, whether we're saving for a holiday or whatever it might be, the things that we all encounter. And we talked about it from a club perspective around, you know, the importance of setting a budget, how to go about creating a budget, and then also thinking about monitoring and reviewing your budget as well. And, you know, a lot of actually getting kind of away a little bit from the numbers, trying to work out a bit more like the process and the background to preparing a good budget. So really, the budget's about all the assumptions that you make that sit behind the numbers, that tell the story of the numbers. So how do you go about doing that and get something solid? So yeah, you've hopefully got some past history, performance, but also, you know, you want to involve people that have got the knowledge and skills that are working in those areas. So, you know, as well as getting good information by involving people, you also hopefully get their buy-in, so that they, you know, when they see that budget that's set for the next year, they take some ownership over it and they understand, you know, what those numbers actually mean. So, you know, it's a critical part of many forms of life, and certainly at a club, because it, you know, if you you know, got a well put together budget that you've prepared ahead of time, and a good system to monitor it, so that it can't get away from you, then you know, you're in a good place. And in football, it's very easy to let that get away from you. So hopefully a useful podcast for your listeners.
Brilliant, thanks, James. And I think you made a really good point there, and it's a reoccurring theme, and something Derek mentioned right from the beginning around involving the right people in the club when it does come to managing your money, from setting budgets to making sure that everyone is across and there is transparency when it comes to communicating budgets, etc. So it is really important that you do have buy-in across the club, and people are involved at the right levels to help and guide the club around budget. So that was last week. This week is all about taxes and just getting a basic understanding of the different taxes that are out there that clubs should be aware of. So James, what are some of the things that our listeners will be able to get from today's podcast?
Okay, so today, very much just looking to identify and at a high level explain the type of taxes that you might encounter at your club, but also then go on to say how these perhaps might be relevant in terms of certainly considerations of risk, but also potential savings as well. So it's, yeah, and very much also just signposting to where you can get further information online. So yeah, really just to kind of explain each of the main taxes that you're likely to see, so that people kind of feel comfortable and understand what each is and why it's relevant.
And I think you're right there, James. It is all around the right signposting. There are lots of good resources out there, and I know you'll be highlighting a number of them today. So let's kick off. I know the first one that we're going to just go over is VAT, and I know there's obviously some changes at the moment around VAT as a tax as a whole. But do you want to just give us an overview of what VAT is?
Absolutely. So so VAT is a tax that's paid on transactions. So it's nothing to do with profit. It's about, yeah, a government tax that's applied to goods and services, and as you say, it's quite relevant at the moment, because obviously as we come out of COVID, government's looking at ways to increase our spending. So they've just changed from the standard rate 20% down, and moved down to 5% for hospitality and tourism, to try and get people either out spending to reduce the prices, or in this case, you know, potentially some of the businesses could take that benefit themselves. So, you know, it's something that can vary. You know, previously, probably going back the best part of 10 years, it was set, the standard rate was set at 17.5%. But also within that, as I've just kind of shown as an example, there are different rates for different products, goods and services. So one that often gets quoted is a reduced rate for children's car seats. There's also some items which are 0 rated, others that are exempt, which may well include a lot of sports activities that our clubs will encounter. So from a club's perspective, essentially, if not every club needs to register for VAT. So at the moment, the level for taxable supplies would need to exceed 85k in a 12-month period. So for many clubs, probably that's going to be too high. So if that's your club, you're not VAT registered, so you don't need to charge VAT on any goods and services. If you are VAT registered, what that means is you have to submit, as probably most people will know, you need to submit a VAT return to HMRC every 3 months, and there you can either reclaim or sometimes even pay extra VAT that's owed. Where it's, and we'll cover this a little bit more detail later, but where it becomes particularly important, perhaps often because clubs that haven't previously encountered VAT is big if it's their first big capital project, or even any big capital project, because of the amounts of money involved. There's the potential that you can claim back VAT on some of the purchases, but it's by no means a guarantee, and it gets quite complex depending on the type of build and items and a whole number of considerations. So we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later. But yeah, in terms of just generally, in terms of which items are, how they're defined for VAT purposes, there's obviously loads of information online. So I'd say definitely recommend to check that out. So, you know, there's guidance on membership fees, providing pitches, paying referees, entry fees, but then things like bar sales, charging spectators, you know, they all have different categories. And you know, that will be the guide that will help clubs decide if you are charging VAT, at what level.
I think it's really good to say here, James, that you've done a great job at pulling together some detailed kind of explanations on each and some really useful links. So those that are listening today, you will get shared some additional resources and information that you can go and digest at your own time. And it's obviously, again, really important to say that there has been some mention around VAT rates, but depending on when you pick this up, they may have changed. We are talking in a period where we find ourselves in of COVID, but that may change depending on when you pick this up. So as we said right from the beginning, please do go and seek any professional kind of advice and support, and use the right relevant resources that will be assigned and aligned to this podcast. I think, James, is really a good question maybe for me to ask, and other clubs might be asking the same question, but does a club need to be a certain legal entity to be VAT registered? I know we covered a little bit around legal entities last week, but do you have to be a certain legal entity to be VAT registered?
No, it's not dependent on your legal entity. It's all about your activity in terms of goods and services and you know, your trading. But I suppose the only thing I would say is if you are, certainly if you are exceeding that 85k, then you probably will want to be incorporated you know, as some legal form, just given the amount of potential liabilities and you know, the level of activity that you're undertaking, that you'd want that kind of limited liability that an incorporated entity has. But no, you don't have to be a certain type. We'll come on a bit later to some of the kind of opportunities around charities and casks, but yeah, in terms of that, no, it's simply about you know, your business, not about your legal entity.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a good question from me to ask, but that makes complete sense. And I think, like you said as well, just around that liability, I know we covered the legal entity kind of very light touch last week, and I know a lot of clubs may be reviewing that in the current climate we find ourselves in, but it's always good for to clubs just to know that there are different options out there and what different avenues they can explore. So James, we've covered that. The next on our list is corporation tax. Do you want to just talk a little bit more around that?
Yeah, so VAT was about a tax on transactions. Corporation tax is different. This is a tax on profits to the government, which is currently set at 19%. In terms of, again, it doesn't matter in terms of whether you're incorporated or unincorporated, you're treated the same. There's again lots of kind of detail which is important as a club in terms of potential exemptions. So something that you quite often hear about is something called mutual trading, which I think helpfully there isn't actually an agreed definition of what it is, but in essence, where I'll try and do it, where for example, you're trading with yourself or your members, as it were. So things like member subscriptions and other income that all comes from your members, then this exemption or definition of mutual trading becomes relevant. So, you know, there's a lot more detail again on HMRC's website around different types of trade. There's also information around potential relief and allowances, which you can so essentially you can deduct any tax that you'd pay for certain items, things like machinery and equipment, which could be paid, which could be deducted rather than taking out as a profit from that tax. So again, you know, there's a lot of kind of intricacies. There's loads of information on HMRC's website, or you know, if you're at the point where you know, you're fortunate to potentially be making a significant profit, you probably want to get a bit of expert support anyway to work out where you could attribute that to work for your club. And yeah, there are a few things that that are definitely taxable. So bank interest. I do remember working with a club a few years back actually who had a quite significant amount of bank interest because they did have decent reserves, and you know, that felt quite tough for them that they'd have to lose a good chunk of that as tax. But yeah, and the other thing out, so we talked about mutual trading, it's other things where you're trading outside that membership. So maybe if the bar, or perhaps you're renting parts of your facility to you know, other operations which are outside of your traditional, say, football or sporting offer, then it's likely that will be taxable. The other thing I suppose to say is that, yeah, because for so many clubs this probably isn't going to be relevant. Sometimes clubs get pursued by HMRC, which in itself can be quite a hassle, and there's the potential of being classed as dormant, which means that basically if your club's annual corporation tax is less than liability is less than £100, and you can show that your club's run exclusively for the benefit of members, then what helps sort of from an administrative point of view is HMRC might propose to make you dormant, and then we'll review the situation every 5 years. So it just, you know, kind of feels like a kind of more of a efficient way to handle this area rather than being pursued for money that's never going to be there, which is the case for a lot of clubs. Okay, so if I move on to business rates next. So business rates now, we're on to again something completely different. Now we're talking about property. So it's tax on property that typically it will be something you'd be notified by the local authority. Again, it's not going to be relevant for all clubs. It will depend on your asset situation. But yeah, it's a tax on property that is used for business purposes. So it could be offices, pubs, shops, sports facilities. The amount that you pay depends on what they call the rateable value of your property, and there's a host of different values which are applied, which are based on the size and type of facility. Well, one thing that's very relevant actually is that, again, the government, probably people will be aware, announced that there'll be 100% rate relief in 2021 for properties which include sports grounds and clubs, which is obviously very welcome for a lot of asset owning football clubs and other sports clubs and facilities. Again, there's some really good information online. You can actually check how your business rates are valued and calculated. There's a little calculator where you can see, and sometimes these are wrong, so it's worth checking what you get through, checking how it's calculated. So what you'll find is different facilities, as I said, based on their size and type, will be essentially priced at a different rate. So it's clubhouse, playing fields, changing room, spectator stands, they'll have an estimation of size, they'll have a set price per meter, and you can work through and see what your bill is. And also another reason that's kind of helpful, and actually something that is certainly relevant for any club that's looking at updating a facility, even reconfiguring it, certainly increasing it, is that you need to remember that whatever you're planning to do could have an impact on the business rates that you pay. So that's definitely something to consider. Yeah, I should say finally, because they're set by, because it's from the local authority, there is the possibility that you can negotiate a better deal from your local authority. So I've worked with clubs in the past that have showed their value to helping the local authority deliver some of their other outcomes, and paid lower business rates because of it. And also will cover what is a standard exemption rather than something that's negotiated, which is around charities and casks a little bit later. So yeah, that's business rates.
So James, many of our clubs and leagues on the call will be operating as businesses. They'll have their own sports facilities, clubhouses, things like that you mentioned. And some will now be in a position where they need to employ staff, whether it be on a part-time basis, full-time basis, grounds staff, administrators, etc. Are there taxes around employing of staff that clubs and leagues should be aware of?
Yes, definitely. And hopefully, we're, again, it's all things we'll be familiar with in our day-to-day lives. So yeah, pay as you earn, so PAYE as people know it, and national insurance. So this is HMRC's system to collect income tax and national insurance from employment. again, there's all sorts of detail and levels and considerations to think through. But if your club has got employees, you may have to deduct tax and national insurance, albeit it's likely only to be relevant for employees who are paid £120 plus per week. Much as we all have, you'll have a tax code, which will then each employee has a tax code which will tell you what they should pay. And in terms of reporting, these employee payments and deductions go to HMRC on or before each payday. HMRC have recognised software to report, and there is free software available. There's all sorts of software available, but there's some free software available if you have less than 10 employees. What else to say? I mean, other considerations are, things like national living wage, and maybe even London living wage. So national living wage, I think it's £8.72 an hour at the moment, but also perhaps most pertinently for clubs, it would depend on the type of contract and their employment status. So you might see self-employed coaches, for example, who wouldn't be paid through PAYE, but then they don't have the same rights and responsibilities as an employee. So again, on the government website, there's a really useful breakdown of different types of contract and employers' responsibilities, which I'd recommend certainly any clubs look at.
Great, James. Really useful information in that section, and especially one that does evolve. The national living wage changes to replicate and reflect where we kind of find ourselves in. So it is an ever evolving piece, isn't it? As they all are, especially in the current times we are and the future times, etc. So as James said, as we've mentioned throughout this, please do make sure you obviously check the most up-to-date and relevant information. So James, you've touched on a little bit around facility development in and around kind of how that might affect business rates, but what other kind of tax kind of questions, issues may clubs, leagues face when it comes to a facility development? Because obviously hot for many clubs that are wanting to grow, expand. I know before the call we were talking about an example of a project you're supporting where there's asset transfers from local authorities to different organisations, clubs, etc. So it's obviously something that does happen. It possibly may happen even more so with the current climate we're in. What do clubs and leagues on the call need to be aware of when it comes to facility development?
Yeah, well, as we said before, this is, if we're getting into facility development, it's obviously the overriding point here is that there's likely to be a lot at stake, and in terms of liability, but also potential savings. So definitely, you need to build in the cost of having that expertise, those professional fees really into your budget. But just to highlight a few points that we see, the rule, so VAT, for example, is a complex point when it comes to facility development. So I think a lot, speaking to I was seeing some of the projects and colleagues in sport, and there are examples sadly out there where organisations and clubs have presumed wrongly that they won't be paying VAT on certain elements or all of a build, and often that's not the case. So there are some opportunities, but it gets very complicated. So there's something people might be aware of where they talk about an annex. So if you reconstruct an existing building so that it meets the definition of what they call an annex, then there's a possibility it could be considered zero rated for that. There's also a whole piece around where there's a new building. that is used for, and they state a relevant charitable purpose, it might be able to give 0 rating. If you can imagine, there's a lot of kind of past history and case law around this sort of stuff. So they then break down what a relevant charitable purpose is and talk about an example of a community, a village hall actually, and how that, you know, is an example. And you can see just about how some football clubs might meet that definition, but it needs a lot of further thought and investigation. Even if you achieve that kind of 0 rating, as it were, for VAT, then if the costs exceed 250k, then actually how that facility is used will be monitored for the next 10 years, because you will have probably achieved that 0 rating based on kind of the usage that you've stated. And if that changes and actually, you know, it's, let's say, used in a more commercial way, then that will, you know, the use has changed, and the decision to be 0 rated, you know, won't be the same, and it could potentially result in extra payments to HMRC. So I think the whole area of that and facility development is something to proceed with caution, take professional advice. There's you know, there's, again, we'll talk about this in a minute, there are some opportunities for how your club is structured to maybe benefit from tax exemptions and gains, which we'll cover in a second. If you're in a fortunate position where you own land and you raise money from the sale of some of that land, then that will have tax implications around things like capital gains. And something a little bit more left field, actually more positive, rather than taking money away. There are some tax incentive schemes actually out there which are designed various reasons to incentivize normally individuals to invest money into projects that, although the benefit is to the individual, so something like enterprise investment scheme, and there's the social enterprise investment scheme as well, they are designed so that individuals can potentially save, well, if the scheme qualifies, again, you need to apply to HMRC, but you could potentially, those individuals could, if they're paying tax themselves, could potentially save up to 30% of their investment, which obviously should be a nice incentive for them to either invest a bit more money into your project or to invest in the first place. So I'll caveat that heavily by saying, again, it very much depends on your club and the project, what the money's for, how it be used, as to whether the scheme will qualify. But it's certainly worth thinking about. And there have been, I've worked on a couple of football projects in the past, and I'm aware of a couple of others where they have qualified for this. So, you know, but it is dependent on things like how much money as a percentage at the moment would the club make from, say, hiring out pitches, because there are certain areas they're excluded within that, but certainly still worth a look. So yeah, but again, you know, as I said, there's potential of big savings and there's potential of big liabilities. So, you know, it's very much a case of, you know, look for that professional support and expect to pay it, and it should absolutely pay for itself. And then, so I've sort of hinted at it a couple of times. There are a couple of tax statuses that people will no doubt be familiar with, or certainly have heard the names. So one is community amateur sports clubs, or CASCs as they're often referred to. So this is a type of status that is available to some sports clubs who meet a certain criteria. So things like being amateur, as you'd imagine, it needs to be open to the whole community. Doesn't matter if you're incorporated or unincorporated, it's a tax status. So and what that means is that it guarantees you certain benefits. So the one that probably we're all most familiar with is gift aid on donation. So obviously that can be a very valuable resource. We see it for charitable projects and things. So if you're a CASC, then you can benefit from gift aid, and it's quite an easy process that you can claim back online. You're also, we talked about business rates already. Well, you're guaranteed a business rate relief of at least 80%, which will be factored into your bill from your local authority. So obviously at the moment the government's waived business rates, but more generally that could be a real big benefit. Then there's no tax to pay on trading profits if turnover's under 50k, and you don't pay tax on income from rental up to 30k. And also, as I've just mentioned about potential capital gains, in general terms, you don't pay tax on capital gains as well. So profit on selling or disposing of an asset. Again, this is an area that changes. In 2015, they actually made it a little bit less restrictive in terms of the type of things that you're allowed to do. So they actually allowed you to pay us, I think I need to check, I think it was 10k, but they allowed a small payment of players. I think it was a lot around cricket and their model, where they often had a kind of overseas player that, and they saw that as not a small enough change that they could keep this kind of amateur status. They changed some of the thresholds as well. So again, it's something that does get updated and changes. So lots of information online from government websites about CASCs. I think there's more than 6,000 clubs registered as CASCs. I don't know how many of those are football clubs. I wish I did, but a portion will be. It's not going to suit everyone. It sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? After the rest of the webinar, because it is quite restrictive. Although I talked about a small amount for paying players, it doesn't really suit that kind of semi-professional and certainly above club. So it suits clubs that are got small turnover, that are asset owning. If you think about it, that rate relief would be a huge factor. So 80%. It's about clubs that primarily receive income from members, and if you've got a history of receiving donations, then you can see that the gift aid is really important. And again, there's a lot of kind of information or past history around things like what can be considered a donation and what is considered, say, for example, a membership fee. And I won't go through all that now, but again, all those kind of conversations and discussion and information you'll be able to easily find online. And you register with HMRC, but yeah, then there's some reporting requirements as well. So it's worth, as I say, thinking about it, particularly if you're asset owning, and you're really are amateur in terms of the level that you want to play at and why you exist. It might not suit other clubs. And then the other one is charitable status, which which is about being an entity that is established for charitable purposes only. So although, you know, a lot of things that football clubs do would be considered charitable, you know, not everything would be for some clubs, particularly some of the bigger clubs. So you know, you need to meet that definition to start with. Again, there's a whole list of what's considered a charitable purpose online on the Charities Commission website. Again, it can be any legal structure, and fairly recently they've just introduced something called the Charitable Incorporated Organisation, which makes it more simple in terms of your reporting requirements. So rather than reporting with your legal structure and Charities Commission, it's a more simpler process. Some similar benefits for CAS, so gift aid on donations, business rate relief at 80%, generally don't have to pay corporation tax, potentially some exemptions from VAT, but yeah, you know, it's very much, you know, the money needs to stay within the charity, so it can't be distributed to members. And unlike CASC, the trading income is kept separate. So often there's a separate trading body that sits underneath the charity. So it suits, comparing it to a CASC, it would suit a bigger club, with larger turnover, asset owning, and significant income maybe from non-members or property income, as opposed to a CASC, or wants a bigger profile too. I think, you know, as I say, a lot of football clubs, you know, unless they're very much amateur and have other ambitions outside of on the pitch, you know, unless you're in that space, it's probably not, you know, it always sounds like a great thing, but actually a lot of football clubs won't, unfortunately, qualify. But yeah, you can see the benefits if you do, based on all the things that we've covered today. You know, it can give you some real advantages.
Well, there's lots of different pieces of information out there, James, isn't there? And lots of varying options for clubs and leagues to look into. And I think we've mentioned it on probably all three podcasts, including this one, that it has to be right for the club, the vision that they have now and the vision that they want to work towards to the future. So lots of information. James, thank you very much for that. Been really insightful again. Thank you very much as well for leading the way on the three podcasts prior to our last one today. All of the information presented from this evening will be available on a guidance document, and it will be shared in due course. For anyone wanting to further extend their knowledge on this topic, head over to Sport England Club Matters website, where there's a host of additional resources, guidances and workshops which volunteers can look to complete and further heighten their knowledge and understanding of what hopefully you've gathered from today. James, just end really for another big thank you for your time today. Great in leading the podcast. No, we didn't have Derek alongside us today, which Derek's great at adding some club insight and club lenses on the topic, but you done well today, so well done to you, James. Thank you very much for that. And everyone, this is the last podcast of this series of Money Matters. There will be other webinars and podcasts released in future weeks and months, so please do check out thefa.com/get-involved/player/club and leagues. Don't forget that one, it is very long, or contact your local county FA and they'll be able to guide you of what is coming.